Sometimes the people treated like strangers are the ones carrying a family's last truth. The crystal chandeliers of the Callaway Grand Hotel shimmered above hundreds of wealthy guests dressed in black silk and diamond smiles, while soft piano music drifted across the ballroom like smoke. Outside, rain tapped gently against the towering windows of Manhattan's most expensive charity gala. But inside, everything felt polished, controlled, untouchable. Clara Whitmore moved quietly through the crowd, carrying a silver tray of champagne flutes, her black waitress uniform perfectly pressed despite the 12-hour shift already weighing on her shoulders. She kept her eyes lowered the way service staff were expected to. Silent, invisible, efficient. Yet there was something about Clara that didn't belong in the background. Maybe it was the calmness in her posture. Maybe it was the strange elegance in the way she moved between tables filled with billionaires and politicians who never noticed the people refilling their glasses. Or maybe it was her eyes. Soft gray, thoughtful, like someone who had spent her whole life watching doors close quietly in front of her. Table 12 needs another bottle of Cabernet, the event manager whispered sharply as he rushed past her. Clara nodded immediately. Yes, sir. Tonight's gala celebrated the 50th anniversary of Callaway Enterprises, one of the oldest investment empires in America. Old money, ruthless money, the kind that built skyscrapers and erased scandals before newspapers could print them. At the center of it all stood Ethan Callaway, tall, impossibly composed, 38 years old with dark hair brushed neatly away from a face the business magazines called intimidatingly perfect. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that probably cost more than Clara's yearly rent, and every person in the ballroom adjusted their behavior when he walked past. Ethan carried power the way some men carried cologne. Quietly, constantly. Clara had seen him once before on television during a financial interview. Cold eyes, controlled voice. A man who answered every question like emotions were unnecessary expenses. Tonight looked no different. Mr. Callaway doesn't tolerate mistakes. Another waitress whispered nervously beside Clara while arranging silverware. Last month, he fired a manager during a fundraiser because the flowers were the wrong shade of white. Clara gave a faint smile, but said nothing. She had learned long ago that powerful people often feared small imperfections more than dishonesty. Across the ballroom stood a black grand piano surrounded by velvet ropes. Antique, elegant, untouched. Most guests barely noticed it, but Clara did the moment she entered the room. Something about the piano pulled at her chest in a strange, familiar way she couldn't explain. During a quieter moment between courses, she found herself walking closer to it while carrying empty glasses back toward the kitchen. The room buzzed with conversation behind her. Laughter, crystal clinking softly. A senator speaking too loudly near the bar. Clara paused beside the piano for only a second. Her fingertips brushed the polished black surface gently. And then she saw it. A tiny ivory key slightly out of place. Crooked by barely half an inch. Almost nobody would notice. But she did. Clara hesitated before carefully setting her tray down beside the instrument. Without thinking, she reached forward and pressed the loose key softly back into alignment. One quiet note escaped into the ballroom. Delicate, fragile. The sound barely lasted a heartbeat. But somehow it cut through the room anyway. Conversation slowed. Heads turned. Ethan Callaway looked up instantly from across the ballroom. His expression hardened the moment he saw her standing near the piano. The air changed. Clara stepped back immediately. "I'm sorry," she began softly. But Ethan was already walking toward her. His polished shoes crossed the marble floor with controlled precision. The room grew quieter with every step. "Who allowed the waitress near that piano?" he asked coldly. No shouting. No scene. Somehow that made it worse. Clara straightened slightly. "Sir, the key was loose. I was only trying to—" "That piano," Ethan interrupted, his voice sharp enough to freeze the room, "is not for servants." Silence crashed over the ballroom. Several guests looked away awkwardly. Others watched with open curiosity, hungry for humiliation disguised as entertainment. Clara felt heat rise into her face, but she kept her posture calm. "I apologize," she said quietly. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You're done for the evening. Pick up your things and leave." Somewhere near the back of the room, someone exhaled uncomfortably. Clara lowered her eyes and nodded once. "Yes, sir." She bent to retrieve her tray, but before her fingers touched the silver edge, another sound filled the ballroom. Not music. A voice. Fragile with age, yet powerful enough to stop every movement in the room. Ethan. The elderly woman stood slowly from her wheelchair near the front table. Eleanor Callaway, founder of the family dynasty. The woman whose approval still terrified board members twice her age. Her pale hands trembled against the armrests as her eyes remained fixed on Clara. Not angry, not confused. Shocked, deeply shocked. Ethan immediately turned toward her. Grandmother, it's all right. The staff overstepped. No, Eleanor whispered. Her voice cracked softly. No, play it again. The ballroom fell completely silent. Clara blinked in confusion. Ma'am. Eleanor stared at her like she had seen a ghost rise from the past. The melody, she whispered shakily. The one you touched. Clara frowned slightly. I didn't mean to play anything. But Eleanor's eyes had already filled with tears. Ethan looked between them, suddenly uneasy for the first time all evening. Grandmother, what are you talking about? Eleanor slowly rose to her feet despite the panic of nearby assistants moving toward her. She ignored all of them. Her gaze never left Clara. Then, with trembling breath, the old woman spoke the words that shattered the entire room. Because that melody, she whispered, belongs to the Callaway family, and only one child was ever taught to play it that way. No one in the ballroom moved. The orchestra had stopped playing without anyone noticing when. Crystal glasses remained suspended in trembling hands. Even the waitstaff stood frozen beside silver trays as Eleanor Callaway stared at Clara like the past itself had suddenly walked back into the room. Ethan's expression darkened with confusion. Grandmother, he said carefully, lowering his voice as though trying to regain control of a situation slipping through his fingers. You are upsetting yourself. But Eleanor did not look at him. Her pale blue eyes remained locked on Clara's face. Come closer, she whispered softly. Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to apologize again, collect her things, and disappear before the attention swallowing the ballroom became unbearable. Yet something in the elderly woman's voice stopped her. It was not authority. It was pain. Quiet, trembling pain. Clara slowly stepped forward. The marble floor beneath her shoes suddenly felt too loud in the silence. Ethan watched her carefully now, his sharp features tightening with visible discomfort. He had spent years controlling boardrooms worth billions of dollars, but this felt different. Unpredictable. Personal. Dangerous. Eleanor lifted a shaking hand toward Clara's necklace. Where did you get this? She asked. Clara instinctively touched the small silver pendant resting against her collarbone. A tiny angel with worn wings. Old. Scratched with time. I have had it since I was a little girl, Clara answered quietly. I do not know where it came from. Eleanor inhaled sharply. One of the women seated nearby covered her mouth in shock. Ethan frowned immediately. Grandmother? Eleanor finally looked toward him. Tears shimmered in her eyes beneath decades of carefully preserved dignity. Your Aunt Vivian wore the exact same necklace the day she disappeared. A murmur spread through the ballroom like a sudden cold wind. Clara blinked in confusion. I am sorry, she said softly. I think you must have mistaken me for someone else. Ethan stepped forward at once, eager to restore order. Exactly. This is clearly a coincidence. His voice carried confidence again, but something underneath it sounded strained now. The staff should return to work. Grandmother needs rest. But Eleanor's expression hardened with surprising force. Do not dismiss her again. The room fell silent once more. Ethan stopped speaking immediately. Few people in New York had ever dared interrupt him. Only one still could. Eleanor Callaway slowly reached into the velvet purse resting beside her wheelchair. Her hands trembled as she removed a small folded photograph worn pale at the edges. She held it carefully toward Clara. Look. Clara accepted the photograph with uncertain fingers. The image showed a smiling young woman standing beside a piano many years earlier. She had elegant blonde hair pinned neatly behind her shoulders and soft gray eyes almost identical to Clara's own. Around the woman's neck hung the same silver angel necklace. Clara's breath caught slightly. Who is she? Eleanor swallowed hard before answering. My daughter. Ethan's jaw tightened immediately. Grandmother, enough. But Eleanor ignored him completely. Vivian disappeared 24 years ago. Her voice had become distant now, trapped somewhere inside memory. She left after an argument with your grandfather about the family business. We searched for months. Private investigators. Police. Every connection money could buy. Her eyes drifted back toward Clara. But we never found her. Clara stared silently at the photograph. Something strange moved through her chest. Not recognition exactly. More like an ache she could not explain. The ballroom suddenly felt too warm. Too crowded. I grew up in St. Agnes Foster Home in Connecticut, Clara said quietly after a long silence. I was left there when I was around 4 years old. They said nobody ever came looking for me. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly as if the words physically hurt. Ethan folded his arms tightly across his chest. This conversation is inappropriate, he said firmly. You are exhausting yourself over similarities that mean nothing. Clara immediately nodded. He is right. I should leave. She tried to hand the photograph back, but Eleanor gently pushed her hand away. What is your birthday? Clara hesitated. November 17th. Ethan's face changed. It happened quickly, barely noticeable, but the shift was there. A flicker behind the eyes. Eleanor noticed it too. You remember now? She whispered toward him. Ethan's voice sharpened instantly. That proves nothing. Clara looked between them, suddenly aware there was a conversation happening beneath the one she could hear. Eleanor slowly turned back toward her grandson. Your father erased her from this family, she said quietly. Every photograph, every record, every mention. Because she abandoned us, Ethan answered coldly. That is what I was told. Eleanor's eyes filled with sorrow. No, that is what you were taught. The words landed heavily between them. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Several executives quietly stepped farther away, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. She had arrived tonight expecting nothing more than another exhausting shift, serving wealthy strangers who barely looked at her face. Now one of the richest families in America was staring at her like she carried a secret buried for decades. I think there has been a misunderstanding, Clara whispered carefully. I am not part of this family. Eleanor looked at her for a very long time before answering. Child, she said softly. Sometimes the truth survives longer than the people who tried to bury it. Ethan immediately stepped between them. This ends tonight. His voice was calm again, but colder now. Controlled in the dangerous way powerful men became when fear entered the room. I will have my assistant arrange transportation home for Miss Whitmore. Clara lowered her eyes politely. That is not necessary. But before she could step away, Eleanor suddenly reached for her wrist with surprising strength. Do not disappear on me too. The words came out barely above a whisper. Fragile. Terrified. Clara froze completely. And for the first time that evening, Ethan Calloway looked not angry but afraid. The rain outside Manhattan had grown heavier by the time the gala finally ended. But inside the Calloway Grand Hotel, the air still felt frozen from the moment Eleanor Calloway reached for Clara's wrist and begged her not to disappear. Nobody quite knew how to recover after that. Wealthy investors quietly avoided eye contact. Board members whispered behind careful smiles. Even the musicians packed their instruments with unusual silence, sensing they had witnessed something far more dangerous than public embarrassment. Clara stood near the ballroom entrance holding her folded black apron in trembling hands while hotel staff rushed around pretending everything was normal again. It was not. Nothing about tonight felt normal anymore. Across the room, Ethan Calloway spoke quietly with two executives near the bar, but his attention kept drifting back toward Clara every few seconds. Not curiosity, calculation. The kind powerful men used when trying to solve problems before they became threats. Clara noticed it immediately. She had spent most of her life learning how to read people before they could hurt her. And Ethan looked exactly like a man trying to regain control over something slipping beyond his reach. Miss Whitmore. Clara turned softly at the sound of the voice. A tall older man approached wearing a charcoal gray suit with silver cufflinks and the calm expression of someone accustomed to handling complicated situations discreetly. My name is Richard Hale, he said politely. I am legal counsel for the Calloway family. Clara nodded carefully. Did Mrs. Calloway send you? Richard hesitated only briefly. She requested that transportation be arranged for you this evening. Clara glanced toward the ballroom, where Eleanor remained seated quietly beside the piano, surrounded by concerned assistants. The old woman looked exhausted now, smaller somehow, fragile beneath the weight of memory. Please tell her thank you, Clara said softly. But I do not think I should stay involved in whatever this is. Richard studied her for a moment with surprising gentleness. Miss Whitmore, with respect, I do not believe Mrs. Calloway intends to let this go. Clara lowered her eyes. Neither did Ethan, apparently, because at that exact moment, he crossed the ballroom directly toward them. The room seemed to tense again as he approached. Ethan stopped only a few feet away from Clara, his expression calm but unreadable. "Mr. Hale," he said evenly, "I would like a moment alone with Miss Whitmore." Richard gave a slight nod before stepping away without argument. Clara remained still. Ethan looked different now than he had earlier in the evening. Less angry, more guarded. The sharp arrogance from before had softened into something colder and harder to define. "You should not take my grandmother seriously tonight," he said finally. Clara blinked slightly. "Excuse me." Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket as rain rolled softly against the windows behind him. "She is 82 years old. Her health has declined recently." Clara immediately frowned. "You think she imagined all of this?" "I think grief changes people." His voice remained controlled, especially after decades. Clara studied him quietly. Up close, Ethan looked tired in a way expensive suits could not hide. Faint shadows beneath the eyes. Tightness in his jaw. A man carrying pressure so constantly he no longer noticed its weight. "Your grandmother seemed very certain," Clara answered carefully. Ethan gave a faint, humorless smile. "My grandmother spent 24 years believing my aunt would come home." He glanced briefly toward Eleanor across the ballroom. Tonight she saw similarities and convinced herself they meant something. Clara looked down at the silver angel necklace resting against her collarbone. "And what do you think?" For the first time, Ethan hesitated. Just slightly. "I think coincidences happen." But his eyes betrayed him, because he did not sound convinced. Clara noticed it immediately. Silence stretched between them while workers cleared empty wine glasses from nearby tables. Somewhere behind them, a chandelier reflected soft gold light across the marble floor. Ethan finally spoke again. "Where did you say you grew up?" Clara folded her apron more tightly in her hands. "St. Agnes Foster Home." "In Connecticut." "Yes." Ethan nodded once as though mentally placing information into categories only he could see. "And nobody ever contacted you? No relatives? No records?" Clara shook her head. "The orphanage closed years ago. Most of the paperwork was lost." Ethan looked away briefly toward the rain beyond the windows. "Convenient." Clara's expression tightened immediately. "You think I planned this?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "I think people do desperate things around money." The words landed sharply between them. Clara felt heat rise into her face, but unlike earlier, she did not lower her eyes. "You know," she said softly, "for someone who believes this is all a misunderstanding, you seem very nervous." Ethan looked back at her immediately. The silence that followed felt heavier than anger. Clara continued quietly. "I did not come here asking for anything. I was serving drinks an hour ago." Ethan's jaw tightened again. Somewhere deep beneath his polished composure, something uncomfortable moved across his face. Shame perhaps, or fear. Before he could answer, Eleanor's voice suddenly echoed weakly across the ballroom. "Ethan." Both turned immediately. The elderly woman stood beside the piano despite her assistant's protests. She looked exhausted but determined. "Bring her to the music room," Eleanor said quietly. Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "Grandmother, this can wait until morning." No, her voice remained soft, yet somehow final. It already waited 24 years. The room fell silent once more. Clara looked between them uncertainly, while Ethan closed his eyes briefly, like a man realizing the night he had tried to control was no longer his. Eleanor slowly lifted her gaze toward Clara again. Tears shimmered faintly beneath the ballroom lights. "There is something you deserve to see." And for reasons she could not explain, Clara suddenly felt afraid to follow her. The hallway leading to the music room felt strangely untouched by time. While the ballroom behind them still carried the glittering noise of Manhattan wealth, this part of the hotel remained quiet and dim beneath warm golden lamps mounted along dark wooden walls. Clara walked slowly beside Eleanor's wheelchair, while Ethan followed several steps behind in tense silence. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows overlooking the city, blurring the lights outside into pale streaks of silver and gold. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. The only sound came from the quiet turning of wheelchair wheels across polished hardwood floors. Clara could feel Ethan watching her again. Not openly. Carefully. like he was trying to solve an equation that kept changing every time he looked at her. At the end of the hallway, Eleanor stopped beside an old mahogany door carved with delicate musical notes faded by age. Her trembling hand rested against the brass handle for several seconds before she finally whispered, "Your grandfather built this room for Vivian when she was 10 years old." Ethan immediately stiffened behind them. "Grandmother." Eleanor ignored him. Slowly, the door opened inward. Clara stepped inside first and stopped breathing for a moment. The room felt nothing like the rest of the hotel. No marble, no modern luxury, just warmth. Memory. Shelves filled with yellowed music books lined the walls beside framed family photographs stretching back generations. An antique fireplace crackled softly beneath a portrait of a young woman seated at a grand piano. Vivian. Even painted and oiled decades ago, the resemblance struck Clara instantly. The same gray eyes, the same thoughtful stillness. Ethan noticed Clara staring at the portrait and immediately looked away first. Eleanor wheeled herself slowly toward an old, upright piano resting beside the window. "She used to play for hours in here," the elderly woman said quietly. "Sometimes until sunrise." Clara stepped closer without realizing she was moving. The piano looked worn but loved. Unlike the polished instruments downstairs displayed for status, this one carried scratches, faded keys, and tiny imperfections left behind by real life. "Real hands. Sit." Eleanor whispered gently. Clara looked uncertain. "I do not think I should. Please." Something in Eleanor's voice made refusal impossible. Clara slowly sat on the piano bench while Ethan remained standing near the doorway with folded arms and visible tension carved across his face. "Do you remember any songs?" Eleanor asked softly. Clara hesitated. "Not really." Her fingers hovered uncertainly above the keys. "Sometimes melodies come into my head, but I never learned where they came from." Eleanor's eyes shimmered again. "Play whatever you remember." Silence settled over the room. Clara swallowed nervously before pressing a single note. Then another. Softly, almost apologetically, a melody began unfolding beneath her fingertips. Slow, gentle, beautifully sad. The sound filled the music room with quiet emotion so suddenly that Ethan's posture visibly changed. Clara did not even seem aware she was playing anymore. Her eyes remained lowered toward the piano as though the melody lived somewhere deeper than memory itself. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears slipped silently down her cheeks. "That is impossible," Ethan whispered under his breath. Clara stopped immediately and looked up in alarm. "I am sorry." Eleanor shook her head quickly. "No, no, child." Her voice broke softly. "That was Vivian's lullaby." Clara stared at her in confusion. "I have never heard that name before tonight." Ethan walked toward the piano now, slower than before. His face had lost all traces of cold confidence. "Where exactly did you learn that melody?" Clara looked genuinely frightened by the question. "I told you already. I do not know." Ethan's eyes searched hers intensely, almost desperately. "Nobody outside this family knows that song." Clara stepped away from the piano bench. "Then maybe your grandmother is right." The words escaped quietly before she could stop them. The room fell still again. Ethan looked at her for a long moment without speaking. Somewhere deep beneath his controlled exterior, uncertainty had finally begun cracking through. Eleanor slowly reached toward a nearby wooden cabinet beside the fireplace. From inside, she removed a small velvet box faded by time. "There is more," she whispered. Clara watched silently as the elderly woman opened the box with careful hands. Inside rested a tiny pair of silver baby shoes beside an old hospital bracelet. Eleanor handed the bracelet toward Clara. "Read the name." Clara accepted it slowly. Her fingers trembled slightly as she turned the faded plastic beneath the lamplight. Then her breath caught. Clara Whitmore. She stared at the bracelet in stunned silence. "No," Ethan said immediately, though his voice sounded weaker now. "That could have been planted." Eleanor looked toward him with visible disappointment. "By whom?" Ethan did not answer. Because for the first time that evening, even he no longer fully believed his own explanations. Clara kept staring at the bracelet while confusion and fear tangled together inside her chest. "This does not make sense," she whispered. "My records say I was abandoned." Eleanor's eyes filled with quiet sorrow. "Sometimes children are not abandoned," she said softly. "Sometimes they are hidden." The fireplace crackled quietly in the silence that followed. Outside, the storm over Manhattan deepened, thunder rolling faintly beyond the windows like something old finally waking after years buried beneath silence. Ethan looked toward the hospital bracelet still shaking in Clara's hands. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, he asked the question he had spent the entire evening trying not to face. What really happened to my aunt? The question lingered heavily inside the music room long after Ethan spoke it. The fireplace crackled softly beneath the portrait of Vivian Calloway while rain continued sliding down the windows overlooking Manhattan. Clara still held the hospital bracelet in trembling fingers, unable to look away from her own name faded across the old plastic band. It felt impossible, unreal, like stepping into someone else's memory by mistake. Eleanor sat quietly beside the piano now, exhaustion visible in every line of her face. For several moments, she said nothing at all. Then finally, she looked toward the fire and whispered, "Your grandfather cared more about legacy than love." Ethan remained standing beside the piano with folded arms, but his posture had lost its usual certainty. "What does that mean?" Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Vivian fell in love with a man your grandfather disapproved of." Clara slowly lifted her eyes. Eleanor continued softly. "He was a music teacher from Boston. Kind, honest, ordinary." A faint sad smile crossed her face. "Which, to your grandfather, was unforgivable." Ethan frowned immediately. "Father never mentioned any of this." "Of course he did not." Eleanor's voice sharpened slightly for the first time all evening. "Your father spent years pretending Vivian never existed." The room fell silent again. Clara moved closer to the fireplace almost without realizing it, as though warmth might help steady the confusion building inside her chest. "What happened to her?" she asked quietly. Eleanor stared into the flames for several seconds before answering. "She became pregnant." Ethan's expression tightened immediately. "And grandfather cut her off." Eleanor nodded slowly. "He demanded she give up the baby if she wanted to remain part of the family." Clara's breath caught softly. Somewhere deep inside her chest, something painful stirred without warning. Not memory exactly. More like an emotion buried too young to fully understand. Ethan rubbed one hand slowly across his jaw. "So she left." "No," Eleanor whispered. "She tried to stay." Her eyes filled with tears again. "Vivian loved this family even after it broke her heart." Clara looked down at the hospital bracelet again. "Then where did she go?" Eleanor hesitated. For the first time that evening, fear crossed her face. Real fear. "I do not know." Ethan stared at her. "You do not know?" "She disappeared 3 days after giving birth." Clara felt the room tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Giving birth to who?" Eleanor slowly looked toward her. Neither woman spoke for a moment because suddenly the answer no longer needed words. Ethan stepped back toward the window, tension radiating through his entire body. "This still proves nothing," he said firmly, though his voice sounded strained now. "A bracelet and a necklace are not evidence." Clara nodded quickly. "He is right." Both Ethan and Eleanor looked at her. Clara swallowed hard before continuing softly. "I cannot just walk into someone else's history because of coincidences." Eleanor's expression broke slightly at the word coincidences. "Child," she whispered, "when you touched that piano tonight, you played Vivian's lullaby with the exact same hesitation she used on the third note." Clara blinked in confusion. Eleanor gave a trembling smile through tears. She always paused there because her fingers were too small to stretch comfortably. Silence settled heavily across the room again. Ethan turned slowly back toward Clara. This time his eyes looked different. Less defensive, more unsettled, as though part of him had already begun realizing the truth, while another part fought desperately against it. "There should have been records," he said quietly. "Hospital documents. Adoption files." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "Your grandfather handled everything privately." "Meaning?" Ethan pressed. Eleanor's hands tightened around the armrests of her wheelchair. "Meaning money can erase many things when powerful men become afraid." Ethan looked away sharply. Clara suddenly noticed something strange then. Not just tension, guilt, deep and inherited. Like Ethan had spent his entire life benefiting from a story he never fully questioned until now. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked softly through the silence. Midnight had passed. Somewhere below them, the last gala guests were finally leaving the hotel. Clara took a slow breath. "I should go." Both Ethan and Eleanor looked toward her immediately. Please, Clara continued softly. I do not know who I am to your family, but tonight has already become too much. Eleanor reached toward her weakly. If you leave now, I may never find you again. Clara's eyes softened with visible sadness. You already lost someone once. I understand why you want answers. She looked down at the bracelet in her hand. But I cannot become them for you. Ethan watched her carefully, and for the first time since the evening began, he seemed to notice something beyond the waitress uniform. Not ambition, not manipulation, fear. Clara looked genuinely frightened by the possibility that any of this might actually be true. That realization changed something inside him. Slowly, Ethan stepped closer. Stay one night, he said quietly. Clara looked surprised. Ethan's expression remained guarded, but softer now. Tomorrow we verify everything properly. DNA testing. Records. Whatever is necessary. Clara hesitated. And if I refuse? Ethan held her gaze for a long moment before answering. Then my grandmother will spend the rest of her life wondering whether she found her family only to lose it again. The words settled quietly between them. Clara looked toward Eleanor, whose fragile hands trembled softly in her lap beside the dying firelight. Then finally, almost reluctantly, Clara nodded once. One night. Eleanor closed her eyes in visible relief. But Ethan did not relax. Because somewhere deep inside him, a terrifying thought had already begun taking shape. If Clara truly belonged to the Calloway family, then everything he believed about his father, his inheritance, and even his own place inside the empire might have been built on a lie. The guest suite on the 32nd floor felt larger than Clara's entire apartment building back in Queens. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Manhattan, glowing beneath rain-soaked streets, while soft jazz played quietly from hidden speakers in the ceiling. Everything inside the room looked untouched. Perfect, like nobody had truly lived there before. Clara stood near the window, still wearing her plain black slacks and white waitress blouse, while hotel staff silently delivered overnight clothing, toiletries, and warm tea she never requested. Every few minutes, she caught herself touching the silver necklace resting against her collarbone, as though it might suddenly explain everything. It never did. Across town, Ethan Calloway sat alone inside his office overlooking the Hudson River. The massive room remained dark except for the faint city lights reflecting against glass walls and the blue glow from his laptop screen. Financial reports lay forgotten across his desk untouched for over an hour. That alone would have shocked everyone who worked for him. Ethan never ignored work. Yet tonight, numbers felt meaningless beside the image replaying endlessly in his head. Clara sitting at the piano. Clara holding the bracelet with trembling hands. Clara looking frightened instead of ambitious. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. Richard Hale quietly entered the office carrying a thin leather folder. You asked for the archived family records, he said softly. Ethan nodded without looking up. Anything? Richard hesitated. Some things. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. Richard placed the folder carefully on the desk. Most files regarding Vivian Calloway were removed from public access over 20 years ago. Ethan frowned immediately. Removed by whom? Richard remained silent for one dangerous second too long. Ethan understood anyway. My father. Richard exhaled slowly. Your father was very thorough. Ethan leaned back in his chair while tension settled heavily across the room. Keep talking. Richard opened the folder carefully. Inside rested several photocopied documents, hospital records, and one faded newspaper clipping from 24 years earlier. Missing heiress leaves family estate. Ethan stared at the headline without speaking. Your aunt disappeared officially 3 days after giving birth at St. Catherine's Hospital in Boston, Richard explained quietly. According to records, the infant was transferred to a private care facility shortly afterward. Ethan's jaw tightened. Transferred where? Richard lowered his voice further. That part is missing. Silence swallowed the office. Rain slid slowly down the glass walls behind them. Ethan rubbed one hand across his face, exhaustion finally breaking through years of disciplined control. Why would my father erase all this? Richard looked genuinely uncomfortable now. Because if Vivian had a living child. He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Ethan understood perfectly. The rightful heir to Calloway Enterprises would not have been his father's branch of the family. It would have been Vivian's child. Clara. The realization settled coldly inside his chest. Ethan stood abruptly and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. For most of his life, he believed he had inherited responsibility for the family empire through discipline, intelligence, and sacrifice. But what if none of it had truly belonged to his side of the family at all? "Sir," Richard said carefully behind him, "there is one more thing." Ethan turned slightly. Richard handed him another document. "I found a sealed financial transfer from your father to St. Agnes Foster Home, dated 23 years ago." Ethan stared at the page. His heartbeat slowed uncomfortably. He funded the orphanage. Richard nodded once. Privately. Every year until his death. Ethan looked back toward the rain-dark skyline beyond the windows. Suddenly, the pieces no longer felt random. They felt buried. Intentionally buried. Meanwhile, 32 floors above the sleeping city, Clara sat awake on the edge of the enormous hotel bed, unable to close her eyes. She had tried. For nearly 2 hours she had tried. But every time silence settled around her, fragments returned. Music. Warm hands brushing through her hair. The smell of old piano wood. A woman humming softly near a fireplace. Clara stood slowly and walked toward the mirror beside the dresser. The expensive borrowed sweater hanging loosely around her shoulders made her look like someone else entirely. Not a waitress finishing double shifts to pay overdue rent. Not the quiet woman customers forgot seconds after leaving restaurants. Tonight, strangers looked at her like she carried history in her blood. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Clara opened the door cautiously. Eleanor stood outside wrapped in a cream-colored shawl with one nurse nearby for support. "I hope I did not wake you," the elderly woman whispered. Clara immediately shook her head. "No, ma'am." Eleanor smiled sadly. "You sound exactly like Vivian when you are nervous." Clara stepped aside quietly to let her enter. The older woman moved slowly toward the sitting area near the windows before lowering herself carefully into a chair. For a moment, neither spoke. Manhattan glowed beneath them, while rain softened the world outside into silver blur and distant lights. Finally, Eleanor looked toward Clara. "You have her kindness, too." Clara lowered her eyes. "I do not even know who she really was." Eleanor smiled faintly toward the city. Vivian believed people mattered more than power. Her expression dimmed slightly. That made her dangerous in this family. Clara sat across from her quietly. Eleanor studied her face for a long moment before reaching into her shawl pocket. Slowly, she removed a small folded piece of paper yellowed with age. "I found this hidden inside Vivian's piano bench after she disappeared." Clara accepted it carefully. The handwriting across the faded page looked rushed and uneven. The ink had blurred in places from old tears. Clara unfolded it slowly and read the first line aloud without meaning to. "If anything happens to me," her voice stopped. Eleanor looked away toward the rain. "Finish it," she whispered softly. Clara swallowed hard before continuing. "Please make sure my daughter knows I never abandoned her." The room fell completely silent. Somewhere far below them, the city continued moving without noticing that one forgotten sentence had just changed everything. Morning arrived over Manhattan beneath pale gray skies and streets still wet from the storm. Inside the Callaway Grand Hotel, silence settled heavily across the upper executive floors where lawyers, assistants, and private advisors moved carefully through hallways lined with expensive paintings and quiet tension. News of the previous evening had already begun spreading through elite social circles. Nobody knew the full story yet, but everyone sensed something dangerous unfolding inside the Callaway family. Clara stood alone beside the breakfast table in the private dining suite, staring down at untouched coffee growing cold beside her hands. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the letter again. "Please make sure my daughter knows I never abandoned her." Those words kept echoing through her mind with painful softness. Across the room, the television played financial news muted beneath scrolling headlines about international markets and rising stock prices. Normal life continuing while her own reality quietly unraveled. A knock sounded at the suite door. Clara opened it slowly to find Ethan standing outside in a charcoal suit without his jacket, one hand holding a folder. He looked exhausted. "The lab is ready," he said quietly. Clara stepped aside without answering. Ethan entered the room and paused briefly near the windows overlooking the city. For several seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them no longer carried hostility the way it had the night before. Now it felt uncertain, careful, like two strangers standing inside the same storm, trying to understand where the ground disappeared beneath them. "You should eat something," Ethan finally said, glancing toward the untouched breakfast tray. Clara folded her arms lightly. "I do not think I could swallow anything right now." Ethan nodded faintly as though he understood more than she expected. He placed the folder carefully on the table. "These are copies of the records Richard found overnight." Clara hesitated before opening them slowly. Inside rested hospital documents, archived newspaper articles, and old financial statements connected to St. Agnes Foster Home. Her eyes stopped on one page immediately. A photograph. Vivian standing outside St. Catherine's Hospital, holding a newborn wrapped in pale blankets against her chest. Clara stared at the image without breathing. Even through the faded grain of the old photograph, the woman's smile carried warmth so familiar it hurt. "That was taken 3 days before she disappeared," Ethan said quietly. Clara touched the edge of the photograph carefully. "She looks happy." Ethan's expression darkened slightly. According to the records, she planned to leave New York permanently. Clara looked up slowly. "With her daughter?" Ethan nodded once. "That appears to have been the plan." Silence settled again. Then Clara asked the question that had quietly haunted her since last night. "Do you think your father stopped her?" Ethan looked away toward the windows immediately. The pause before he answered felt painfully long. "I do not know what to think anymore." Clara lowered her eyes back toward the documents. Somehow that answer frightened her more than denial would have. Another knock interrupted the room. Richard Hale entered alongside a woman in medical scrubs carrying a small testing kit. Everything about the moment suddenly became painfully real. "This will only take a few minutes," the nurse said gently. Clara nodded quietly while Ethan remained near the windows with visible tension tightening across his shoulders. The nurse collected samples silently before leaving the room again with Richard. "Results should return by this afternoon," Richard explained softly before closing the door behind him. The suite fell silent once more. Clara exhaled slowly and moved toward the windows, wrapping her arms around herself. 32 floors below them, Manhattan rushed through another busy morning completely unaware that one DNA result might shake one of the city's oldest financial empires. Ethan watched Clara carefully now. Not as a waitress, not even as a stranger. More like someone standing at the edge of a truth neither of them knew how to survive yet. "Why did you become a waitress?" he asked quietly after a long silence. Clara looked surprised by the question. "Because bills exist." Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. Clara looked back toward the city. "I studied piano for a while when I was younger." Ethan frowned slightly. "You did?" Clara nodded faintly. "A volunteer at St. Agnes taught music classes every Saturday." Her expression softened with distant memory. She said, "I learned unusually fast." Ethan's eyes darkened thoughtfully. "Did she ever mention where your talent came from?" Clara gave a small, sad smile. "She used to joke that maybe I came from royalty." Ethan lowered his gaze immediately. Something about hearing that hurt more than it should have. Hours passed slowly afterward. Too slowly. By early afternoon, tension had settled over the entire hotel like fog. Clara remained mostly quiet while Ethan disappeared repeatedly into phone calls with legal advisors and executives. Several times she caught hotel staff staring at her differently now. Not dismissively, nervously, respectfully. She hated it. Nothing about herself had changed overnight. Yet suddenly everyone looked at her like she belonged somewhere above them instead of beside them. It made her uncomfortable in ways she could not explain. Finally, shortly after 3 o'clock, Richard Hale returned carrying a sealed envelope. Nobody spoke as he entered the suite. Even the city noise outside seemed to disappear beneath the weight of the moment. Ethan stood slowly from the desk near the windows while Clara remained frozen beside the piano she had not touched all morning. Richard looked toward Ethan first. "The results are conclusive." Silence. Then Ethan took the envelope with visibly unsteady hands. For several seconds he simply stared at it without opening it. Clara felt her heartbeat pounding painfully in her chest. Eleanor arrived moments later, supported gently by her nurse, her pale face filled with fragile hope and terror all at once. Ethan finally opened the envelope. The room became so quiet that even the soft rustling paper sounded loud. His eyes scanned the page once. Then again. Slowly, all color disappeared from his face. Clara whispered softly, "What does it say?" Ethan looked up at her. And for the first time since they met, there was no arrogance left in his eyes at all. Only truth. Raw and unavoidable. His voice came out almost hollow. You are Vivian Calloway's daughter. The words seemed to change the air inside the suite itself. You are Vivian Calloway's daughter. Nobody moved after Ethan said it. Eleanor closed her eyes as tears slipped silently down her face, while Richard Hale lowered his head respectfully beside the doorway. Outside the windows, Manhattan continued roaring through another afternoon of traffic and ambition, completely unaware that one sentence had just altered the future of the Calloway empire forever. Clara stood perfectly still beside the piano, her hands trembling faintly at her sides. For several seconds, she looked as though she had not fully understood what Ethan said. Then slowly, almost instinctively, she touched the silver angel necklace resting against her chest. No, she whispered softly. Not denial exactly. More disbelief. Ethan looked down at the DNA report still open in his hands. His voice remained quiet now, stripped completely of authority and distance. The match is absolute. Clara turned away immediately and walked toward the windows overlooking the city. Her breathing had become shallow, uneven. I spent my whole life believing nobody wanted me, she whispered. Eleanor's face broke completely at those words. Oh, sweetheart. Clara shook her head quickly, tears finally filling her eyes. Do you know what it feels like growing up with no history? She laughed softly then, but the sound carried no humor at all. School projects about family trees. Medical forms asking about relatives. Watching other children get picked up for holidays while you sit beside a window pretending it does not hurt. Ethan lowered his gaze slowly. Clara looked out across Manhattan as rain clouds drifted beyond the skyline. And now suddenly I belong to one of the richest families in America? Her voice cracked quietly. How is anyone supposed to understand that? Nobody answered because there was nothing to say. The truth had arrived too late to feel simple. Eleanor finally wheeled herself closer. You were never unwanted, she whispered. You were stolen from us. Clara turned sharply toward her. By who? Silence fell again. Ethan slowly folded the DNA report and placed it onto the table beside him. That is the question, isn't it? His voice sounded colder now. Not toward Clara, toward the past itself. Richard stepped forward carefully. There is something else you should all know. Ethan looked up immediately. Richard hesitated before continuing. This morning I requested access to additional private archives connected to your father's financial records. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. And Richard removed another folder from beneath his arm. 3 months after Vivian disappeared, your father established a confidential trust under a false company name. Clara looked confused. What does that mean? Richard opened the folder slowly. It means someone continued paying for your care anonymously throughout your childhood. Ethan frowned. The orphanage. Richard nodded once. And later, your music education scholarships. Clara stared at him in shock. Wait. Her voice softened with confusion. Someone paid for those? Richard gave a slow nod. Every piano lesson. Every school tuition extension. Even your apartment deposit 6 years ago. Clara looked genuinely stunned. I thought those grants were random. Ethan looked toward Richard sharply. Who authorized them? Richard hesitated again. The signature authorization traces back to your father. Silence crashed through the room. Ethan's face hardened immediately. No, Richard met his eyes carefully. Your father knew Clara was alive. Eleanor covered her mouth softly as fresh tears filled her eyes. Clara looked between them in confusion. Then why did he never come for me? Nobody answered immediately because none of them knew. Ethan turned away toward the windows again, tension radiating through every line of his body. For years he had defended his father's reputation without question. Jonathan Calloway had been respected in every financial magazine, every boardroom, every charity foundation in New York. Controlled, brilliant, untouchable. Yet piece by piece, that image was collapsing into something darker. Not cruelty exactly. Fear. Fear powerful enough to bury truth for decades. Clara sat slowly on the edge of the sofa as the weight of everything finally seemed to settle over her shoulders. So he watched my life from a distance, she whispered. Richard lowered his eyes quietly. It appears that way. Clara laughed softly again, but tears rolled down her cheeks now. That is somehow worse. Ethan looked toward her immediately. Clara. She shook her head before he could continue. Do not. Her voice remained gentle, but tired. You spent last night treating me like I was trying to steal something from your family. Ethan's expression darkened with visible shame. Clara wiped her tears quietly. And now I find out I was abandoned close enough to be monitored, but never loved enough to be brought home. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Eleanor finally reached for Clara's hand with trembling fingers. I would have searched forever if I had known. Clara looked at her grandmother for a long moment. Then slowly, she squeezed her hand back. Not fully forgiving, not fully trusting, but no longer pulling away either. At that exact moment, Ethan's phone began vibrating sharply across the glass table. He glanced down at the screen and immediately stiffened. "What is it?" Richard asked. Ethan answered without looking up. "The board found out." Everyone fell silent again. Ethan slowly looked toward Clara. "There is an emergency shareholder meeting tonight." Clara frowned softly. "Why?" Ethan's eyes held something heavy now. Something almost apologetic. "Because according to my grandfather's original estate documents," he paused briefly before finishing, "you are not just part of this family." Clara felt her heartbeat slow painfully inside her chest. Ethan swallowed once before continuing quietly. "You are the legal heir to Callaway Enterprises." By 7 o'clock that evening, the executive boardroom of Callaway Enterprises looked less like a business meeting and more like the center of an approaching storm. Manhattan glowed outside the towering glass walls while rain continued falling softly over the city below. Inside, dozens of board members, attorneys, investors, and senior executives sat around the enormous walnut conference table, speaking in tense whispers that stopped the moment Ethan Callaway entered the room. Clara walked several steps behind him, wearing a simple dark navy dress provided by the hotel staff earlier that afternoon. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy. Yet somehow she carried herself with more quiet dignity than half the people inside the room combined. Conversations faded instantly as every eye turned toward her. Some looked curious, others nervous, a few openly hostile. Clara noticed all of it. Ethan noticed too. For the first time in years, he hated the atmosphere inside his own boardroom. Eleanor entered shortly afterward beside Richard Hale, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the exhaustion visible in her face. The entire room rose respectfully as she entered. Not out of affection, out of fear. Old fear. The kind, powerful families passed down through generations. Ethan remained standing at the head of the table, while Clara quietly moved toward the far corner of the room, clearly uncomfortable beneath so many staring eyes. "Miss Whitmore," one board member suddenly said sharply, "I believe immediate family should sit at the table." The words carried more challenge than kindness. Clara hesitated awkwardly. Ethan looked toward the empty chair directly beside his own. Then, without hesitation, he pulled it back himself. The room fell silent. Nobody in Callaway Enterprises had ever seen Ethan Callaway pull out a chair for anyone. Clara looked surprised. "You do not have to do that." Ethan met her eyes calmly. "Yes," he said quietly. "I do." Slowly, Clara sat beside him while whispers spread quietly across the room again. Ethan remained standing for several seconds before finally speaking. "You have all seen the DNA confirmation." His voice sounded steady, controlled, but no longer cold. "Clara Whitmore is the biological daughter of Vivian Callaway." Silence followed immediately. One older executive adjusted his glasses nervously. Another board member cleared his throat softly before asking, "And what exactly does this mean for the company?" Ethan looked down briefly at the original estate documents resting on the table before him. Then he answered with brutal honesty. "It means my grandfather's controlling shares legally transfer to Vivian's direct heir." Nobody breathed. Clara immediately turned toward him in shock. "Wait." Ethan finally looked at her fully. "The company belongs to you." The room erupted into overlapping voices at once. "This is absurd. We cannot hand over a multi-billion-dollar corporation to someone with no experience. She was a waitress yesterday. There must be legal alternatives." Clara sat frozen beside Ethan while wealthy strangers debated her existence like a financial inconvenience. Her hands tightened quietly beneath the table. Ethan listened for nearly 30 seconds before suddenly speaking again. Not loudly. Somehow that made the room quieter faster. "Enough." Silence returned instantly. Ethan looked around the table slowly. "Some of you have worked with me for over a decade." His voice remained calm, but something heavier moved beneath it now. "So let me make this very clear. Clara Whitmore did not create this situation. My family did." Nobody interrupted. Ethan continued quietly. She was hidden from this family for 24 years while everyone in this room benefited from the lie. Several board members lowered their eyes uncomfortably. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking the words nobody expected to hear. And I was part of that lie too. The room froze again. Ethan Calloway admitting fault publicly was almost unheard of. He looked toward Clara briefly. Last night I treated her like she did not belong in the same room as us. His jaw tightened slightly. Turns out she belonged here more than any of us realized. Clara looked down immediately, visibly overwhelmed. Eleanor quietly wiped tears from her eyes nearby. One investor finally spoke carefully. So what happens now? Ethan looked toward Clara again before answering. That depends on her. Every eye in the room turned toward her instantly. Clara sat motionless for a moment beneath the weight of billions of dollars, generations of power, and expectations she never asked for. Slowly, she stood. Her voice trembled slightly at first. I do not want revenge. The room remained completely silent. Clara glanced around the massive boardroom, filled with polished suits and guarded expressions. Yesterday morning I woke up worried about subway delays and overdue electric bills. A few uncomfortable smiles appeared around the room. Clara continued softly. I still feel like that same person. Her eyes drifted briefly toward the rain beyond the windows. I cannot pretend to suddenly understand corporate law or investment strategy because of a DNA test. Ethan watched her carefully now, and for the first time since this began, there was something close to admiration in his expression. Clara took a slow breath. But I also cannot ignore the truth. She looked toward Eleanor gently. My mother spent her life trying to come back to this family. Her voice weakened slightly. I think she deserved better than silence. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for water glasses anymore. Clara slowly removed the silver angel necklace from around her neck and held it quietly in her hand. I do not know what happens next, she admitted. But I know one thing. Her eyes lifted toward the room again. Come now. Steady. No child should grow up believing they were forgotten simply because powerful people found the truth inconvenient. Silence settled over the boardroom with almost physical weight. Outside, thunder rolled softly beyond the skyline. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly before doing something nobody expected. Slowly, publicly, without hesitation, the most powerful man in the company stepped away from the head chair at the table. Then he looked toward Clara and quietly said, Where you sit now should have been yours all along. The room watched in stunned silence as Ethan Calloway walked away from his own seat and left it empty beside her. Clara stared at the chair for several long seconds. Not triumphant, not proud, just quiet. Because after 24 years of being invisible, she finally understood something heartbreaking about power. Sometimes the loudest victory is simply being seen.